Before we officially begin the event, we just have some event dialogue guidelines that we would like to share. Those are respectful dialogue, including non-proselytizing. We do not attempt to convert others or speak derogatorily about any tradition. Willingness to engage in interreligious, respectful dialogue. And openness to explore topics in a compassionate manner, including those that are potentially divisive from a variety of viewpoints. So with that, we are officially starting the event, and I will turn it over to the chair of the Parliament of the World's Religions, Nitin Ajmera.
So welcome everybody, good afternoon. It is a great afternoon to be here with you. Obviously, we were together in Chicago in August of 2023. And one of the prime feedbacks that we received from all of you was, how do we carry forward our work? How do we carry forward the dialogue? And how do we carry forward our continued initiatives and be part of the ever-changing world? And we, the trustees and staff and the officers of the organization, sat together and we said, the only way to continue to do this is to engage in a continuous dialogue through various things. And how we want to do that is through these webinars and through various events that are planned throughout the year. There are hopes of about doing it online, hybrid, whatever way, but we want to come forward and continue to discuss the issues that we have. And for that, we are here in our first very webinar, right? And I'm so blessed and honored to be sharing this space with Reverend Jim Wallis, Ian Bassin, Dr. Azza Karam, my co-chair, Charline Manuel, and obviously you heard Emma as we began with, and Stephen is also here with us. So it's just a blessing to be with you, all of you, and to be here together to discuss what is democracy in 2024 and how does our faith come together. For me personally, faith is my belief, my ideologies, my guiding light, something that shows me what is right and what is wrong. And through faith is where I find solace in comfort that the approach me and the world is taking has some kind of a divine intervention, if it is divine, or some kind of a positive energy that guides us to a right future. That's faith for all of us. And democracy for all of us is always a place where we can voice our needs, our requests, our concerns, somewhere where we are heard and not being told, you're not important, right? You are important and you're part of us and you're part of what you want. And not that everything is met to its 100% capacity, but at least there are ways to solve our needs. And that's what democracy is, where we have a voice, we have a seat at the table, and we are counted and not ignored. Now, the question that comes to our mind is, how does faith and democracy come together, right? And many times, because of our last 100, 200 years of history, somewhere we have said that democracy and faith are different and they're not together and they cannot come together. And that is where came the rise of secular states, where it was more about, we do not prefer any particular faith or religion or guide or anything. But secularism is not about not favoring anybody. Secularism is about including everybody and having everybody together and saying we celebrate you and you and you and you, whether you are from any country, any religion, any race, any sex, any background, any orientations, whatever you are. The spirit of your human life is what we celebrate, and that is what democracy and faith is together. And for me, these dialogues throughout this year for 2024 are important because such a large portion of our world's population, our brothers and sisters around the world, are going to go out and express their choices. And as they express their choices, do they make the right choice? Are they going to be heard? And do we say, would I be somebody else will vote for me or somebody else will do it for me? Or there are others who are saying this, so why should I need? Every voice matters, my friend. Every voice is what needs to be done. So these series of webinars, these meetings that we are organizing is to reinforce our faith that both faith and democracy is what we need in 2024 and beyond. We cannot leave one behind than the other. We cannot say that we are a secular state, so we don't prefer anything. We need to start saying we are a secular state, so we celebrate everybody, we enjoy everybody, we include everybody. And hence, that's what that is. And throughout these webinars, we're being guided by what we know as the Global Ethics document. And Charline, Manuel, my friend and co-host here, will talk about how these webinars are designed around our global ethic. And I pass over this further to Charline. And I thank all of you for joining us and remaining part of the Parliament and creating the voices that will make a better world. And thank you for giving me the time and listening to me. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Charline.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nitin, and welcome everyone. At the heart of the Parliament of the World's Religions are core values and principles that guide our place in the world and our commitment toward a world of peace, justice, and sustainability. The Global Ethic document, whose formal title is Towards a Global Ethic, has been the foundational document of the Parliament since 1993. The Global Ethic emerged from a lengthy and widely collaborative effort to identify the values, standards, and principles people hold in common, religious or not. Because the Global Ethic was a collaborative work, it was clear that there are differences between individual religions. Differences that should be respected always. It also reveals that the religions share several common values found in their teachings, and these form the basis of a global ethic. These values and principles are familiar to us. Do not murder and do not lie, just for example. And others, for example, a principle found in many religious and ethical traditions of humankind for thousands of years. What you do not wish done to yourself, do not do to others. Or in positive terms, what you wish done to yourself, do to others. Now, interesting to me, if you go to any playground where children are playing together, no matter where you are, and ask them if they know what the golden rule is, they can tell you, they can recite it. However, it seems that as some of us grew up into our adult years, we forgot what many were taught as children. The global ethic says this teaching that has been known through many religions for thousands of years, treat others as we wish others to treat us, should be the irrevocable, unconditional norm for all areas of life, for families and communities, for races, nations, and religions. The global ethic breaks down these shared values, standards, and principles into 5 directives, and then elaborates on them further. The first directive, for example, the global ethic captures something at the heart of FOCUS24's programs, as we see many places around the world are ruled by terror, dictators who oppress their own people, and widespread violence. With 2024 being hailed as a make or break year for democracy, we must do what we can to guard and guide against high levels of violence expected. The first directive calls for nonviolence. The second directive speaks to a just economic order. The third directive, truthfulness and ethical standards from leaders in every field. The fourth directive, equal dignity of women, men, and other genders. And the fifth directive, that we care for our home, our shared home, the planet. These are the freedoms and values and principles that can be affected in this year of democracy. The global ethic expresses the view that the religions cannot single-handedly solve the environment, the environmental issues, economic, political, and social problems of the earth. It also states that earth cannot be changed for the better unless the consciousness of individuals is changed first. And that is where our ethical, spiritual, and religious teachings can move us toward a global ethic and bring us into being a world of peace, justice, and sustainability, and where every human being is treated humanely. We must look to and rely on our communities of faith to provide what cannot be attained by economic plans, political programs, or legal legislation alone, but rather to take up the responsibility for living our faith, standing for democracy, and shaping a common future, perhaps in ways we have never done before. I want to jump right into our exciting speakers today. I am ready, and I hope you are ready too. This is exciting. I want to introduce our first speaker for you this afternoon. Ian Bassin is co-founder and executive director for Protect Democracy. He previously served as associate White House counsel, where in addition to counseling the president and senior White House staff on administrative and constitutional law, his responsibilities included ensuring that the White House and executive branch officials complied with the laws, rules, and norms that protect the fundamentally democratic nature of our government. His writing on democracy, authoritarianism, and American law and politics has appeared in I want to just say everywhere, but I'll go ahead and name a few: the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Atlantic, Slate, Salon, the New York Review of Books, and other publications. He is a recipient of the 2023 MacArthur Fellowship and Scroll Award of the Social Innovation, and has repeatedly been named among the 500 most influential people in Washington by Washingtonian magazine. He received his JD from Yale Law School and BA from Wesleyan University. Ian, welcome.
Thank you, Charline. Thank you, Nitin. Thank you, Emma, Stephen, and to everybody in attendance today. It is such a profound privilege to be, frankly, having this discussion and alive at this moment. As Charline noted, this is the year of democracy, and to kick off this event at this time and to be a part of it, I feel deeply honored, because this year of democracy, more people around the world will vote in elections than in any year in human history. And I think it's an incredible privilege to be alive at such a moment. But it is also an incredible responsibility, because as many of us now know, we are also living in a moment of profound challenge for our democracy. In any challenge, there are opportunities. And so what I wanted to do with my brief time with all of us today is talk a little bit about the context of the moment we're in, some of the challenges we're facing, and some of the unique challenges and opportunities that faith communities can step into this moment and harness to help us lead to a better place for our democracy and for all of our children. So what I want to start with is talking a little bit about the context of the moment that we are in. If we can advance, Emma, to the first slide. We are living in a moment that political scientists refer to as the recession of the third wave of democracy. Next. What they mean by this is that in its modern form, democracy has risen and fallen in a series of waves since the early 19th century. The first wave rose with the revolutions in the United States and France, bringing democracy, imperfect though it was, to the modern era, and then fell. A second wave rose after World War II, with the formerly imperial powers receding, formerly colonized nations becoming independent and free, many initially becoming democratic, and then that wave crashing as many of those democracies fell backwards into dictatorship and authoritarianism. And then finally, next, Emma, in the final quarter of the 20th century, the third wave of democracy rose as democracy spread to its furthest reaches yet, reaching more countries and people than at any point in human history. But that wave crested and peaked in the early aughts, and since then has gone into reverse. Next. As democracy has receded in nations around the world, people are more and more living under non-democratic forms of government. What you're looking at here is a graph from the Swedish Institute Varieties of Democracy, which shows the percentage of the world's population living under democratic government. That middle graph, that black line in the middle with the gray band around it, shows the percentage of the total global population living under democratic government. And you can see over the last decade, it has gone off of a cliff. Next. As democracy has receded, what has been rising in its place is what political scientists refer to as a new form of government, hybrid authoritarianism or competitive authoritarianism. And they give it that unique name because it differs from non-democratic forms of government that were prevalent in the 20th century. In the 20th century, when democracy died, first, typically it happened at the barrel of a gun, tanks rolling into the town square. Second, when it died, it was absolute. Those who came to power abolished democracy outright, banned elections, competitive parties, and created one-party dictatorships. Both of those two things tend to be different in the 21st century. With the exception of what is happening in Ukraine, more often in the 21st century, democracy has not died at the barrel of a gun, but rather through an anti-democratic government coming to power through an election, and then once in power, dismantling democracy from within. But when they do that, they have maintained the veneer of democracy. They've maintained legislatures and courts, opposing parties, and even elections. But those elections are not free and fair. Next. As this has been happening around the world, here in the United States, if we advance to the next slide, you can see we have not been immune to this trend. Over the last 15 years, according to Freedom House's score on their Freedom in the World report, the United States has declined from having a rating of a 94 out of 100 on their score of the quality of a country's democracy to an 83, placing the United States not among the world's leading democracies, but on par with Argentina, Mongolia, and Romania. Next. As this has been happening, attitudes towards democracy have been eroding as well. 30 years ago, only 1 in 16 Americans said they would be comfortable with military or army rule in this country. Today, that number has jumped to 1 in 5. Next. And the bulk of that change has been brought about by agnosticism towards democracy among younger Americans. If you ask Americans to what extent they believe it is essential to live in a democracy, older Americans overwhelmingly think it is. Younger Americans are much more unsure about whether democracy is indeed the preferred form of government. Next. And so as a result, we have seen a wave of autocrats come to power across the world in the 21st century. Now, next. What do these autocrats do when they come to power? There actually is a fairly consistent pattern that you can discern across the world, from Venezuela to Hungary, from Turkey to Brazil. Next. We refer to it as the autocratic playbook, and it involves 7 things. First, these autocratic movements politicize independent institutions like the civil service, law enforcement, and eventually the military. Second, they spread disinformation, including from the government. Third, they aggrandize power in the hands of the executive and undermine checking institutions like legislatures, courts, the free press, the private sector, and yes, civil society communities like faith communities. Fourth, they quash dissent. And we see that happen in new and different ways, not just the banning of books and limiting what can be said or taught or read, but also using the regulatory state to retaliate against critics. Fifth, they scapegoat and delegitimize vulnerable communities. This has been the tyrant's favorite tool since antiquity, because if you can pit people against each other on the basis of race or religion or sexual orientation, it's easier to pick their pockets of money and power. Sixth, they corrupt elections. And finally, they incite violence. And yes, we've seen all of those play out in recent years. Next. Now, what are the unique challenges and opportunities for faith communities in the context of this moment? There are several. I want to share them next. First, there are several practical threats that we must be very conscious of that are part of that authoritarian playbook. As I mentioned, one of the tyrant's favorite tools since antiquity is to pit people against each other, including on the basis of religion, to scapegoat, in particular, minority religions for special negative treatment. We've seen that happen here, for example, in the United States in recent years. You can see that on the left. In addition, the politicization of independent forms of government like law enforcement can be used to target the most vulnerable, including the religious institutions who serve them. We've seen that happen as well in recent years. Finally, when the state says that one expression of religion should be accepted over others, it threatens the conscience of every person. And of course, if we do not maintain free and fair elections and democratic institutions, all of our other freedoms, including religious freedom, are at risk. But there are opportunities of things that we can do to address some of these challenges. Next. First, there are nonpartisan actions that faith communities can help take, particularly in this year of democracy, in this year of elections, to help restore faith in our institutions. What you see on the left is a program that my organization, Protect Democracy, has put out with Interfaith America called the Faith in Elections Program, the Faith in Elections Playbook, which helps use the communities of faith to help educate people on the mechanisms that govern our elections, how they work, because the more people understand how elections work, the more people can have trust and faith in the process. In particular, this is an opportunity for communities to recruit people to participate in the process and perform service, recruiting people to be poll workers, building relationships between civic and faith leaders and those running our elections, so those running our elections can get accurate information out to citizens to be able to meaningfully participate in our process. Second, to defeat authoritarianism, we need to build a broad coalition of people who are able to set aside policy and political disagreements in order to prioritize a defense of democracy. This must be a broad multi-faith coalition, and faith organizations can play a crucial role in organizing this coalition. My colleague Chris Crawford spoke about this theme in his presentation at the Parliament of World's Religions last year. It is finally important, and we know this so well in our communities, to not just stand up for our own rights, but to stand up for everyone's rights. Because the voting rights of people who may vote differently than you, or that may vote differently than me, are as important as ours. And the religious freedoms of those who may worship differently than you, or differently than me, or not worship at all, are just as important as our own freedom to worship. And there are opportunities to defend those who come under attack, and we must form a united defense for those whose rights come under attack. I'll give one example. Over the last several years, there was an effort by the United States Department of Homeland Security to single people out on the basis of their religious practice because they were ministering to migrants coming across the United States southern border. Some of those people were pastors, including Pastor Kaji Dusha, who was singled out for her religious practice and put on a special DHS watch list. Our organization, along with several others, represented Pastor Dusha in a lawsuit to vindicate her First Amendment rights not to be singled out for practicing her religion. We were heartened that when we did that, religious communities across the country from multiple faiths came to speak up in Kaji Dusha's defense in order to underscore the principle that in this country, as should be true around the world, one's freedom of conscience, one's freedom to worship, and the freedom to pursue one's religion should not be reason for special targeting by the government. Finally, this community has a special opportunity to push back on one of the core pieces of the authoritarian playbook, which is the stoking of violence. Blessed are the peacemakers, we know, and we hold a special role in speaking out for peace over violence as a way of resolving our disagreements. Fundamentally, that is what democracy is about. It is about resolving our disagreements peacefully. Next. I want to end on this thought. Liberal democracy, and I mean liberal in the classic Enlightenment political theory sense, not the colloquial American political sense, was born out of the bitter experience of hundreds of years of religious warfare. The Enlightenment generations were tired of battling each other over trying to impose one version of the good life over others. There was simply too much bloodshed. and liberalism came about as a way of having a system of government that was tolerant of different visions of the good life. And it was the seedling in which modern democracy took root. When Alexis de Tocqueville came to America, he recognized that what was unique about democracy in this country was not so much the Constitution or the laws, though important they were in preserving democracy, but what he called the habits of the heart, the way that citizens lived and breathed tolerance for one another and agency in self-government. I think we've lost a bit of that practice in recent years. And I think, as Charline noted in her introduction, and Nitin noted in his introduction, those habits of the heart are reinforced by faith communities first and foremost. And if we don't restore those habits of the heart and re-exercise the muscles of how all of our communities behave as democratic communities outside of government, but simply how we engage with one another, with tolerance, with mutual respect for one another, and mutual empowerment, we will forever be fighting an uphill battle to deliver the promise of democracy. But if we can restore those habits of the heart, I think they will actually prevail over any political ideology, over any set of laws, or over any constitution. Because if we can be a people that believe in peace, that believe in democracy, that believe in tolerance and respect for one another, the government and the system of government that will flow through that will be one that we will want to hand off to our children and to our children's generation. So I want to thank you all for letting me participate here. Look forward to questions, and I'm honored to be on this panel with Dr. Azza and with Reverend Wallis.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My heart is filled with joy because you ended it on a positive note. That there is hope if we persist. Thank you so much, Ian. We appreciate it. I want to take this next moment to introduce Dr. Azza Karam, who's going to give a response to Ian's effort here today. And Dr. Azza Karam is the founding president and CEO of Lead Integrity, a global consultancy and management company with a roster of professional women of faith in all spheres of life. She currently serves on the board of the Trustees of the Parliament of the World's Religions. We're happy about that. The Temple of Understanding, the Royal Interfaith Institute, as well as the International Alert. She has over 3 decades of service in international development, humanitarian, peace building, and interfaith work, including as a senior advisor at the United Nations, as Secretary General of Religions for Peace, and President and CEO of the Women's Learning Partnership. She has taught in several universities around the world and published in multiple languages. She is named as one of the Muslim 500, the world's most influential Muslims. Dr. Azza Karam, thank you so much for being here.
You again went on mute.
Okay. All right. I think it should be okay now. I was saying thank you very much, Charline, for that very gracious introduction. And thank you to the chair of the Parliament, Nitin, for that overview of this incredibly exciting focus for the Parliament for the next foreseeable few months on democracy. And my goodness me, Ian, thank you very much indeed. That was an absolutely stellar presentation, which I enjoyed thoroughly. Thank you for sharing that wisdom. I don't really necessarily have much to respond to beyond saying, wow, brilliant, thank you. Just a couple, perhaps, of questions to help, as you say, what was the term you used, stretch the muscles of our heart. And as we do so, a few things that might help as we reflect on. One of the most, I think, in my humble opinion, beautiful things about faiths in general is the extent to which they inspire us to be better as humans in general, and the extent to which they humble us vis-a-vis one another and vis-a-vis whatever power we see as much bigger than our current institutions or governments or spheres of life, something higher, something in a sense that we have to all be accountable to equally. So therefore, it kind of supposedly should help us. Faith is supposed to give us that opportunity to see one another as equals in a context which is always, of all the institutions that we have, contexts which are deeply hierarchical and built on notions of hierarchy. Now, those those institutional contexts, as you well pointed out, actually tend to be political, but they also are derived from models which are actually religious in nature. So the modern governments as we have them today are actually derivatives of empires which were faith-based, faith-inspired to a large extent, but also deeply hierarchical. They saw the world in a particular way. The world was structured and divided in a particular way. I come from a region, Egypt, which is referred to often as the Middle East, without reflecting that this is the middle of the East from the perspective of the colonial dominant power at that time, which is the United Kingdom and France, who had colonized, and we were the Middle East. There was a Far East and there was a Near East, right? Now, interestingly, the only two names we still use today are Middle East and sometimes Far East. We've forgotten about the Near East, but interestingly, those are also the parts of the world which are in especially grand turmoil today, thanks to that colonial legacy. In other words, our political institutions, which we need to come together for, to try to hold accountable and to honor the democratic aspiration, are derived from religious institutions which are not necessarily themselves that deeply democratic. And I think being sensitive to the fact that we're looking for an aspiration based on faith and with faith communities, which themselves are still struggling to be democratic, is a sensitivity that would be good to bear in mind. In other words, we are not coming from places of perfection, democratic perfection, trying to hold our governments accountable to that perfection. We are residents of spaces which need to be cared for. They are religious institutions and faith-based communities too. So it's not one perfect, one imperfect, but we all share a certain amount of imperfection, which has then implications on what it is that faith communities can best do. I was very struck by the notion of building broad multi-faith coalitions, and I think that that's exactly right. And I know that I'm looking forward to Reverend Jim speaking also to some of those realities. I think the truth is we are indeed in an era where we have plenty of multi-faith initiatives, plenty, and increasing almost by the month in different parts of the world. But do we, and that's the question, do we have an interfaith coalition that is of equals, that is sharing the commitment and indeed perhaps some of the same language that would hold accountable our democracy, values, and institutions? An interfaith is not the same as a multi-faith. And perhaps we need to not only be sensitive to the difference, but to see if we should be perhaps moving towards a genuinely interfaith and therefore, per definition, multi-stakeholder coalition that's not just religions, that would be able to hold accountable based on the lessons we're learning from our own respective traditions and institutions. I think that's what I just want to pose out there for us to think of with tremendous thanks for what has been shared so far.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Azza Karam. Let's keep going. We've got a few questions in the chat. We're going to come to those as best we can, but we want to queue up for our next speaker. I am excited to introduce someone I have long admired, Reverend Jim Wallis, writer, teacher, preacher, and justice advocate, who believes the gospel of Jesus must be transformed from its cultural and political captives and always be good news to the poor and oppressed. He is a New York Times best-selling author, public theologian, renowned preacher, and commentator on ethics and public life. And he is the inaugural holder of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Chair in Faith and Justice at the McCourt School of Public Policy and the founding director of the Georgetown University Center on Faith and Justice. In 2022, Washingtonian Magazine named Wallis one of the 500 most influential people shaping policy in DC. Raised in the Midwest, in a Midwestern evangelical family as a teenager, Wallis questioned, which led him to the Black churches and communities of inner city Detroit, my hometown. He spent his student years involved in the civil rights and anti-war movements at Michigan State University. He's the founder of Sojourners and is the author of 12 books, soon to be 13, including America's Original Sin, Racism, White Privilege, and the Bridge to America, God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It. Kind of a tongue twister there. Thank you. But there is a new book coming, and it is entitled The False White Gospel: Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Refounding Democracy. That's going to be released on April the 2nd of this year, just a few weeks, really. And it's currently available for pre-order. And Wallis is also hosting popular podcast, The Soul of a Nation. He served on President Obama's White House Advisory Council on faith-based and neighborhood partnerships, and has taught faith and public life courses at Harvard and Georgetown University. He also serves as a research fellow at the Georgetown University Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Wallis has previously taught at Harvard's Kennedy School for Government and was awarded an honorary doctorate in humane letters from Georgetown University in 2007 when he gave the college commencement address. Fun fact here, Coach Jim also served for 22 seasons as a Little League coach for his 2 basketball-playing sons. Welcome, Reverend Jim Wallis. So glad to have you here today.
So for this conversation, I'll just say I'm really pleased and blessed, I would say, to be with Itan and you and Azza. And I'll say Ian is one of the great protectors of democracy in this nation. So his history was people need to learn that history, because history could be about to be changed in some very alarming ways or some positive ways. So I'll just say I'm very grateful that the Parliament is doing this series because, well, I'll just say this, that democracy is at risk, as Ian said, but this time is a test of democracy. It is that, and more people are coming to learn that. But it's also a test of faith at the same time. And my colleagues here and colleagues watching this, and I think this year I want to take colleagues like this and become more of a community from just colleagues, a community into an effort that is so essential to the integrity of our faith. And to younger people who are often, a lot of my Georgetown students would be in the none of the above religious affiliation category, the nuns. I like both kinds of nuns a lot. But they're looking to see, they're watching to see what faith communities do, where we come down on these critical tests, choices, decisions that we have to make. So what I try to do in this book is not just critique white Christian nationalism. The book starts with that, and we've got lots of great books on that by many scholars. But it's trying to refresh and reframe some iconic biblical texts that could help us really move toward what many of our mentors call a beloved community. I mean, my friend and not former pastor, but still pastor and now also senator, Raphael Warnock, says voting is a kind of prayer for our future. And John Lewis, who mentored a lot of us, called the vote precious, and also told us to pray with our feet. So let me start with one of those texts from the first chapter, first book of the Bible, Genesis 1:26, which is a bedrock for me, a framework for all of this, that is both multi-faith and Azza interfaith as well, because it really is spoken to in really most of our traditions. So imagine all the political noise we're hearing all around us these days. Part of my daily discipline is to read the media and read the signs of the times at the same time. So imagine all the political noise everywhere that we're all hearing and paying attention to. In the middle of that, the text begins with some words I love. It says, "Then God said," so be quiet, the rest of you, all the noise. Then God said. And what God said was, let us create humankind, all humankind, after our own image and likeness. To me, that's the foundation for any earthly talk of human rights and civil rights, and I would say voting rights. Because let me be blunt, any effort to restrict or suppress a vote because of the color of one's skin, or all the identities that Ian pointed to, the North Carolina Supreme Court used this language: efforts that are surgically targeted on racial minorities. Surgically, those efforts, I would say, are not just a political problem or a bad civic practice. Those efforts are an assault on Imago Dei, the image of God. So what we're trying to do here together is create, I would call it an Imago Dei movement that really asserts itself underneath this battle for democracy. Politics won't be enough this time. And having people listen to different media, our media, when they live really in parallel universes, people do now, parallel universes of information. And so when Jesus says, for example, you'll know the truth and the truth will set you free, he's not saying know the truth and lie less often. He's saying, no, the opposite of truth is captivity. Truth and freedom are indivisible. And so we have this vocation of faith leaders, like good journalists do, and some pay attention to and many don't, of helping people find the truth. Because if we don't help them find the truth and they're oblivious, they're stuck, they're controlled, they're loyal to lies, even big lies, like the election being stolen, they're captive, they're stuck. How do we help people get free by making the truth more accessible, more available, more understood? Go deeper than politics here. Or I love the Good Samaritan. You just talked about the Golden Rule. The Good Samaritan text, there was a lawyer who asked Jesus a question. Now, in the text, I can tell this is a Washington lawyer, but I know that tone of voice. He says, who is my neighbor? Exactly who is my neighbor? Not who is my neighbor, how can I welcome them? It's who do I have to put in that category? And Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. I remember in Judean culture, people didn't think there were any Good Samaritans. people saw them as the other, as dangerous, as false worshipers, all kinds of names that we've heard. And he used the example of this Samaritan, who they would have called people from a mixed race, finding likely a Jewish man on the side of the road, beaten up. And he's other to him, and he helps an other to him, while religious leaders pass by and pay no attention. And so that's a powerful example of the most important question in this election year, I think, is who is my neighbor? Who we regard as a neighbor and who don't we? And that I love the Galatians text 3, 28, where Paul talks about the class, race, gender. These are the divisive pillars, barriers, polarizing factors in all our societies. All are in play in different kinds of ways. He says, no, they're done now for those who are followers of this itinerant brown-skinned Palestinian rabbi. And I learned that this text was a baptismal formula and text in the early church. So all these early Christians, new community following Jesus, said, okay, so what we're about, we're not perfect, but what we're about is breaking down these barriers, overcoming them. That's not extracurricular for us. That's core to our mission. It's vocational. And so they're kind of saying, so if you don't want to be part of that kind of community, you better go somewhere else. Because that's not who we are. What if our American churches in particular, my tradition, were saying that at all the baptisms? So this was a spiritual principle, but it has aspirations for a whole society. And in Jesus' day, there wasn't much voting going on. And Azza's right that our traditions have often been anti-democratic. And I think white Christian nationalism is really anti-scripture. I would say, I'll be bold here, white Christian nationalism is anti-Christ. Take the name. The name spells the heresy, white. Now, this is the most, from Jesus preaching and on, the most inclusive, genuine, multiracial message on the planet. This is what, and it's now white. Or Christian. What they mean by Christian there is it's called dominionist theology. It's not service, it's control, it's dominance, it's being in charge of a society. That's not Christian. And then nationalist. My goodness, Jesus' last words to his disciples was the Great Commission. Go into all the world, teaching them to observe everything I've taught you. So this global message that the World Parliament is trying to put out in the world through this program is not nationalist. It's so the word, and to me, heresy, for me in my tradition, heresy is something that draws us away from Jesus. That's my tradition. And so we're working multi-faith and interfaith. We work with Interfaith Alliance, and Ibu just emailed me last night. But for us, these are core ways forward. So it isn't just a critique. I'm not just doing a critique of white Christian nationalism and its colonization, but really it's how do you move forward, take people deeper? How do we don't go left, go right, but go deeper into the traditions of our different faiths? So I think we have a critical moment here. And I think Dr. King said it well. The church is not meant to be the master of the state or the servant of the state, but the conscience of the state. And that's what I turn to in this election year. And I think a lot of young people are watching this to see who we be. Jesus has suffered an identity crisis in America. When I saw shouting Jesus prayers in the Senate gallery when the insurrectionists took it over on January 6th, and flags, Confederate flags and Trump flags and Jesus flags. How do in my tradition, we gotta bring Jesus' true identity back to this crisis that we're facing. And this book's called The False White Gospel. The original title was going to be, do we believe this or not? Here are all these texts, and do we believe them or not? So I'm quite willing to have a dialogue, even a debate about the narrative of this in this electoral season. And we on this group, in this call, we can contribute to the faith factor. in this election. There's a lot of bad religion going around, and the faith factor isn't very good right now. Our job, our vocation, our calling, it sounds like a big, bold one, but it is. How do we change and make the faith factor more consistent with what our faiths really say? Let's take it deeper than just a partisan argument, which they want to make it. How do we change the faith factor in this electoral season? And that's what I think the Parliament's trying to do here. And I just am very grateful for your effort to do that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Azza?
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Another deep, meaningful, and profound, I think, presentation that absolutely moves the heart itself. Again, to use Ian's metaphor, just expanding the muscles of our heart and our mind at the same time. What if, Reverend Wallis, what if the changing the faith narrative or changing the narrative around our times now is including the narratives within the Christian spaces? What if that narrative would have to be changed by non-Christians? What if there is an equal responsibility for non-Christians in the change of that narrative about Jesus, around Jesus? What if that's the case? What would that actually mean for the movements and the identity crisis that you put it so eloquently, Jesus suffering an identity crisis in America? What would it actually, how much would it challenge us that those who would need perhaps to change the narratives may not even be exclusively Christian or Christians at all? And I say this because, again, I go back to the point, and I completely concur with you in, multi-faith, interfaith. But for me, an interfaith narrative has to include the narrative of the indigenous peoples of this land and every other land.
Absolutely.
Because this has been part of the history of this nation, the karma of this amazing nation, that it carries within it the wounds of what has been perpetuated against the indigenous peoples. It carries within it the karma of the wounds of slavery, which are still leading to very diverse narratives, which are not necessarily cohering and are not always cohering in the interfaith spaces either in this country. I look at it as an observer, as someone who is passionate about this country, as has chosen it to be one's own at a very old age. I didn't come here when I was young. I didn't get fashioned by this country. I am relearning my own sense of faithful identity as I live in this space. And as a Muslim, I look at it from the reams of the Islamic experiences, which were experiences of empire, but also experiences of colonialism. So there's that multiple perspective of being able to look at this space. Thank you for mentioning the nuns. Often we don't integrate the tremendous service that nuns around the world continue to provided long before we had secular institutions and ministries and state departments and whatever. Actually, 90% of those who contribute to international development, as education, as health, as everything that we know, 90% of those who have contributed historically have been women of faith. Many of them have been nuns. And I think being able to honor the roles of women of faith, nuns and others, is a very integral part of the narrative of democracy, transformation, honor. It's a very critical narrative. And it's not, I don't say this because I'm a woman. I say this as a political scientist who has seen how things tend to be very presented in a male-dominated context that builds on and is indeed available and possible because of the contribution of women of faith around the world and from different faith traditions. And a very, very important acknowledgement and gratitude to you also, because you actually mentioned human rights. Civil rights is human rights. And the human rights discourse was possible. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was possible And by the way, the process of coming up to it was stewarded by an American woman, Eleanor Roosevelt. But she worked with people from around the world, including many religious leaders of different religious traditions. But the narrative of human rights was possible because we have faiths. And this was the common values of all faiths. So actually, we need to reclaim human rights as a faithful discourse, as a faithful narrative, not as an alternative, not as a parallel, but as something that was possible because of the religious doctrines and possibilities and realities and the common values that all religions and faiths contribute to. And if we can claim this, if we can honor it, we may be able to revive something that this country is perhaps, in addition to South Africa, quite renowned for, which is civil rights. The image in my mind, the most powerful image of interfaith rights claim is that picture where you had Martin Luther King Jr. with his hands on each side, and you had Rabbi Herschel and Malcolm X, and they stood together and they marched together. That visual is extraordinarily powerful, and it's extraordinarily missing in our public civic political spaces today, that image. And I think we need to revive that, Reverend Wallis, and you've been integral to so much of this shift. But we are lacking this, where the other person on this side or on that side is an Indigenous leader, and there are women galore on that front leading. Thank you. You remind me, of my early first going out to preach from Sojourner years ago. I go to a campus or a Christian college, or in the church auditorium, there were almost always two rows of Catholic sisters sitting in front with their full garb, and I would say, "Sisters, what are you doing here?" And they would say, "Well, we're local." I said, "Well, I figured that, but why are you here?" "Well, this is a very conservative place." I said, "Yeah, I know. That's kind of why I came." They said, "We thought somebody should have your back." So I've had nuns as bodyguards for years, and but at the end, see my students, many of them are looking at what we religious people say and do, and don't say and do, and they decide not to affiliate with us. It's affiliation. Most believe in God or something beyond themselves, and they're the ones that are asking the hard questions of us. And they say things like, "I never heard about the Black Church before." Well, the Black Church, that started with slaves hiding from white people talking about their faith in those hush harbors, became the church in America that's most impacted the world. And so that tells us about the margins. And I talk in the book about the doctrine of discovery, a really important point, which is underneath this Christian nationalism. And there was this big Indigenous National Conference here last week in Washington. And one of the speakers is kind of an extended member of my family, and she spoke to that group. And in fact, if we don't America's original sin was not just slavery and not just the near genocide of Indigenous people, it was this underneath notion of a hierarchy of human value. And what some of the Christian leaders said about Indigenous people who were here, it just violates every principle in all of our faith traditions. So Indigenous people and kidnapped Africans, he became the chattel. We took land and labor and built our nation on that. And so we got to go deep into that and not just worry about winning an election one way or the other. So that's why this could be, Eddie Glaude, who wrote the foreword of the book, says this is a time when everything is collapsing and everything is possible all at the same time. And he says it well, because we're in great danger here. But also, if we go deep enough, this could open up doors for this nation to become, and it's all over the world, the elections are genuine, inclusive,
multiracial democracy. So this could take us deeper and further. It's not just protecting ourselves, and it's not just saving the democracy, it's fulfilling democracy. Because we have yet to fulfill democracy, we can't just try and save it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I want to say amen to that. I want to just jump in. We're running a little bit behind because we got a little bit of a late start, but there are a couple of questions in the chat. So if you all will be willing to let me just kind of take a couple of those questions, that would be very helpful. I want to start with one in particular that is directly addressed to Ian, if you don't mind, Ian. And I'm just going to read exactly what it says here so I don't infuse my thoughts on it. It says, it's remarkable that the Mr. Ian Bassin thinks duly elected through free and fair elections, Prime Minister of the world's greatest democracy, is an autocrat. He is entitled to his opinion, but it shows how off the mark he is. This inaugurating session itself calls into credibility of the events Focus 2024. Ian, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm so grateful. I think it was Mr. Ghosh who asked that question. I love the opportunity for disagreement. I actually think it doesn't undermine the credibility of this focus on democracy and this parliament event. I think it underscores the credibility because, as Emma said at the beginning of today's session, one of the ethics here is to be able to have disagreements respectfully, including on divisive topics, and to talk about them. In fact, I would say that's not just an ethic for the parliament of the world's religions, it's an ethic of democracy. That's what democracy is about. It's about being able to talk about our different opinions and have different viewpoints and engage with them respectfully and thoughtfully. And so I embrace Mr. Ghosh's opinion here, and he's right. It is obviously my opinion. I appreciate that he acknowledges I can have my opinion. It's not the parliament's opinion; it's mine. But there are some disagreements there that I think are worth. I would say something about, because there's an implication in Mr. Ghosh's point that just because someone is elected through a free and fair election, that is sufficient to being a champion of democracy and to not being prone towards autocratic behavior. And what I tried to articulate in my opening remarks is that I don't think that that's sufficient, that just being elected alone is not enough to strengthen democracy and protect it going forward. Governing with respect for the right to dissent, governing with respect for the rights to freedom of speech, governing not just with respecting the right to protest when one disagrees with one government, but to embrace that protest and to say, hey, that's the spirit of democracy. If people disagree with what my government is doing, they should be able to speak out. They should be able to peacefully protest it. I think embracing and empowering those things are core to what it is to be a strong democracy. And I want to see more respect for those things, not just in India, but all around the world, in the United States as well. Because without that, I think democracies are in danger. And I think that that's a line between leaders who strengthen democracy and those who lean more autocratic. But I think these are the things that we're supposed to be able to discuss, right? And discussing them in a forum like this is actually the beating heart of democracy. So I embrace Mr. Ghosh. I note there's another panelist, another comment in the chat, in the questions from Mr. Noreen, who clearly also has a very different view about how to protect human rights from the perspective of the Hindu community in India. And the robustness of the disagreements of all three of us is, I think, a testament to the forum that the parliament has created. And I think exploring those disagreements over the course of this forum is a great way to honor democracy and honor disagreement. And so, Mr. Ghosh, I shake your hand, I embrace you if I could, and I thank you for offering that opinion.
Are there any examples of countries we can examine that have resisted autocratic forces coming to power in order to understand what works?
History doesn't always repeat, but it does often rhyme. I think Mark Twain said that a long time ago, or someone. And in what I've just researched and written here, I talk about some of those histories. There were movements in the 1930s that we all are aware of, and look at what they meant then and what they meant now, both that failed to prevent autocracy. In fact, movements for autocracy, but they're also successful resistance to those movements, even at that time and since. So, I mean, in my tradition, I'm calling this a Bonhoeffer moment. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the courageous German young pastor who was at Union Seminary, and while he was there, he would go to Abyssinian Baptist Church, probably the only white guy Abyssinian every Sunday from Union, and black preaching, music, and theology shaped his what was called the Confessing Church back home in Germany. So they tried to stand up, and they failed, but now they've inspired. South Africa was inspired by Bonhoeffer, the Kairos movement there, the anti-apartheid movement. So we see movements around the world. I say in this book, every movement has to decide who you can persuade and who you must defeat. Now, I mean non-violently, but at the ballot box. So I think there are persuadables out there who aren't liking what they're hearing or are uncomfortable. They won't even know what white Christian nationalism means or call themselves that, but they're persuadables. Other people are very militant. And some of the people who say the last election was stolen with no evidence for that are trying to steal this one. Intimidation, violence, threat of violence. So we're part of something called Face United to Save Democracy. And it's in 10 states. It's multiracial, multi-religious, and multi-generational. I got Steph Curry to do a wonderful video today. Why vote? So this is moving in about 10 key states where voter suppression and intimidation is on the rise. And so you're going to have, rabbis and imams who are all supporting this, as well as a lot of clergy, black clergy in particular. And it's really, one rabbi said the other day in tears, young rabbi said, this is like when Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel was raised here, marched side by side. We're coming back to all that. That's what I want to see. And so we've trained 1,000 poll chaplains. These are poll chaplains who go into polling places with their collars on. I called it lawyers and collars. And we're practically on the ground in those states. Turnoutsunday.com is a place to go and see about this. We're training chaplains, not just clergy, but lay people and multiracial, multi-faith. So we're going to be on the ground, not just in the air with narrative, in key states, trying to, in fact, practically make a difference in the outcome of elections.
Amen to everything that the Reverend just said. And I would add, in addition to a Bonhoeffer moment, I think we can look to countries like Poland as well, which recently overthrew its illiberal-leaning government by a coalition of people who disagree about politics and policy, but wanted a more democratic, more liberal democratic form of government. And you saw that in Poland. You saw it also recently in the Czech Republic, where people said, we disagree about so much in our policy and our politics, but we agree on the foundational principle of democracy, that we have those disagreements peacefully. We settle them through elections, legislative votes, separation of powers, checks and balances, respect for individual rights. And I think we've got to do that here. So for example, the organization that I lead, on our staff, we have progressives, we have moderates, we have conservatives. We have people who worked for Senator Elizabeth Warren and people who worked for Senator Ted Cruz. And they work together, even though they disagree about all manner of issues under the sun, to strengthen the foundations of our democracy. And I think that recipe from Poland, from the Czech Republic and elsewhere, is the recipe for protecting democracy in the 21st century.
Absolutely.
I love to be in your staff meetings.
It's a hell of a Thanksgiving party.
I was just thinking exactly the same. I would love to be a fly on the wall in those meetings in general. I wanted to give particular gratitude to Reverend Wallis for affirming the necessity of integrating Indigenous peoples in our struggles for interfaith human rights. And I wanted to also say that I think it takes a lot of effort to do that. It has to be determined and deliberate, and it may well also require the courage to change our narratives, our own narratives that we find already perfectly fine and sensible and make sense, but maybe, in fact, indeed, what we are most challenged with now is that those narratives which are supposed to be so reasonable are actually not seen as reasonable by a significant amount of people around the world and in this country as well. So what is it that we're, how courageous are we to open up our narratives to critique from within? And I think that the question that Ian answered so brilliantly points to the fact that we have a lot of voices that are feeling angry, disempowered, marginalized, and some of them can become even violent, not only violent in action, but violent in words. And I think this verbal violence is something that we need to be very sensitive to, especially those of us who work within the faith-inspired spaces. We all believe in some way, shape, or form that the word matters. And there is today perhaps the most intense, thanks to the technology of information, there's the most intense resurgence, increase in verbal violence towards one another, some that we don't even realize this is actually violent when we speak to and about one another. And I think that sensitivity is important. I think also a very important thing to keep in mind, we may not have examples to follow, by the way. We may be living in an era, and the Arab Spring was a very, very powerful indicator. We may be living in an era where we know what we need to resist, but we have no idea what the prototypes we need to be aiming for look like. We live in an era where we have all the rules and laws and guidance and legislation necessary. We live in an era where we have all access to all faith traditions, and all that is good and so on, but we actually may be struggling with what is the change supposed to look like. What would that be? And that uncertainty, radical uncertainty and insecurity is why we all need to come together and not leave any more margins amongst one another. But then we have to challenge ourselves for how we speak to one another and how we listen to one another. And that, I think, has to be a very, very different thing than what we're seeing around us today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. And you bring me right back to the Parliament's signature document, the Global Ethic, where we're very conscious that we have differences in our religious belief and understanding and interpretation, but still at the heart of our teachings, there are just certain things that are common and that we have shared values. And if we can rely more and more on those and focus our attention on those, just perhaps that can be a guiding way to take us through these uncharted waters, as Dr. Oz is saying. We may be making this up as we go along, but we need some kind of foundation, some values at least, to help get us there. So we see that happening. I want to turn this over to Emma because she's got something fun for us to do, huh?
Absolutely. So our FOCUS24 initiative is intentional about going beyond the speaker podium to have engagement, networking, and skill building among participants. So we didn't get to everyone's questions in the chat. However, we now have time to bring up those questions with each other, have some conversation with each other. And I'm going to put two prompt questions up on the screen now. However, also feel free to have your own questions with each other. But the two questions that we have are, how have you personally been affected by the challenges to democracy? And how can we utilize what we've learned today into practice? How can the Parliament assist with this effort? So we're going to be sending everyone out into small groups for discussion with each other. We're going to have 15 minutes for that. And then when we come back together, I will share a few highlights from what you all have discussed. We are all back in the main room all together now. If anyone would like to share any highlights in the chat from their discussion, then I can read those out loud. But we don't have any. Yeah, oh, we do have one. We have that it was shared that we need to listen to disengaged populations and listen to why it does not matter to them.
Yeah.
And that's the only highlight that we have in the chat. So I will turn it over to our chair, Nitin Ajmera, to share some closing remarks, and then we'll just have a couple announcements, and that's all. Oh, we did have, all right, a couple more. Try to get more questions instead of just one or two. Oh, yes, all right. Thank you for that suggestion for our future events. And we need to work on cross dialogue between age groups. Everyone shares a similar sense of fear in the climate of our country as a member of a minority faith group, as a faith leader, and as an immigrant. Everyone expressed a sense of safety for them and their group.
Okay, great.
So we'll turn it to you, Nitin.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Reverend Jim Wallis, Ian, Dr. Azza Karam. What a beautiful insight and perspectives to the challenges we face as a community of people, not only just in America, but around the world this year, and how all our faiths and our choices come together to define our future, our common path. When I joined the parliament early on, somebody said to me, one of our fellow trustees, that the problems to the world can only be solved by faith. They cannot not be solved by any other way. We may think that we're solving them through our institutions and our governments and our coalitions or United Nations and things like that. But in reality, the real force of change is always our true faith of love, passion, brotherhood, sisterhood, companionship, and happiness for the common good of the people. So our common future is only about the happiness that we will all share. Looking forward, how do we reflect back in the last 20 years? I keep saying this, like if we were to fast forward to 2043, when it is 150 years of the parliament's existence, what are we looking back and saying that what did we do in the last 15, 20 years and shape the world through our work? And the only way we can say that we are done something, we are there, is if we can prove or if we can make our people believe that they're happier than what they were in 2023. And that can only come through us joining hands and sharing the spaces that we all have. So thank you once again for everybody for joining, for listening to us, making this webinar a huge success. Again, sincere thanks to Reverend Jim Wallis, Dr. Azza Karam, Ian, and Charline, Emma, great, and all my colleagues and the staff who worked in the background to put this together as a launching pad. The hours of work that my trustees have spent, my teams in the office have spent. Thank you so much for everything. We're looking forward to more of these events, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue. I appreciate all of you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Nitin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just a couple of announcements. Mark your calendars for the upcoming events. The next ones coming up are going to be on March 8th, Women on the Front Lines of Defending Democracy, and March 12th, Religion and Civic Spaces, Navigating Challenges and Fostering Unity. If you go to the FOCUS24 section of the Parliament's website, then you can see all events coming up in the series. We also want to encourage all FOCUS24 participants to engage in the FOCUS24 community space in Zoom throughout the year, even in between events. After this meeting ends, you can find this community space in your Zoom by going to the team chat along the top of your Zoom app window, and then channels along the side menu. This is a space for open forum, responding to conversation prompts, sharing resources, and networking. In fact, right now you can find resources that our panelists today shared. You can head there right after this event and introduce yourself. Next, all FOCUS24 events are recorded and will be accessible to FOCUS24 registrants throughout the year. You can find recordings of past FOCUS24 events in the FOCUS24 section of the Parliament's website. And after the end of the year, these recordings will be archived into the Parliament's digital archives, which Parliament members will continue to have access to. If you are not already a Parliament member, you can become a member today to support the Parliament's work and enjoy access to digital archives, a global network, exclusive events, and Parliament event discounts. Visit parliamentofreligions.org/membership. And that is all. Thank you to everyone for being here today. We'll see you at the next event.